Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. And do you remember when the Tories and their shills in the media kept asking Labour where they're getting the money from for their planned £27 billion worth of green investment? And Labour kept saying, well, we're going to borrow to invest for things like this. But the Tories and Tory media persisted. But where's the money coming from? You're going to increase debt, etc., etc. In the end, Labour had to drop the commitment, although do note they haven't ruled out doing it, they've just dropped the commitment. Well, look at what the Tories are doing. I mean, you'll have to look because our privatised media aren't drawing your attention to it. First, Sunak announces that he will abolish national insurance altogether during the next Parliament. Labour calculate this to be a tax cut worth £46 billion a year on its own, something the Conservatives have not argued with. Neither Sunak nor Hunt have budgeted for this, or even said how they intend to pay for it in general terms. Last week, Starmer asked Sunak directly, is this going to be done by cutting pensions or by raising other taxes? Sunak was asked more than once and wouldn't rule either out. And the media are essentially silent. Why aren't they attacking a plan to blow a £46 billion hole in the budget? Why aren't they demanding that Sunak says how he's going to pay for this commitment? And now Sunak's done it again. Sunak says he's going to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Now, there's a few things to say about this. Right now, it's about 2.3%. When Labour were last in power, it was 2.7%. So we should be asking the Tories three pertinent questions here. First, why did defence spending, go down whilst they were in government if they take defence so seriously? Second, why are they only committing to restoring half of the defence spending reduction that they instigated in their 14 years in power? Why not promise to put it back where Labour left it? And third, how are they going to pay for it? Sunak is effectively saying he's going to boost defence spending by £75 billion over these next 6 years. So to the point where it'll have risen to £87 billion a year by the end of the decade. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has checked the maths and found that Sunak is employing a bit of a fiddle. In fact, he's applying two fiddles. He's getting the number by freezing defence spending for 5 years. So you imagine we're going to boost defence spending up to 2.5% by 2030. And you think, so it's going to be ramped up slowly, right? No. The way it's been worked out in the detail, the IFS have said, is by assuming you're actually going to freeze defence spending for the next 5 years. While Europe's at war, brilliant idea. Let's reduce defence spending in real terms whilst we're facing a real crisis here, just so that he can then claim if he adds a few billion to the budget in 2030, he'll have achieved this aim. But it gets worse because then you think to yourself, but the government have specifically said that this will be a boost of £75 billion over those 6 years. That's not what other people have assumed. They have said that. The Treasury actually put out a press release saying this is going to be worth an extra £75 billion over 6 years. So the IFS economist who was looking at this noticed that the government are claiming that this uplift will only cost £4.4 billion in 2028, which of course is inconsistent with this idea that you're going to get this defence boosted right now and that you're going to boost it by 75 billion over these 6 years. And what they're saying, what the IFS are saying is Sunak is basically picking and choosing different baselines in order to suit him with his different statements. There's no consistency to his statements. It's all smoke and mirrors. The money isn't there. The money's not going to be there. If Sunak were really planning to boost defence spending, there would be a clear explanation as to how it's going to happen, saying where the money's going to come from. There isn't. It's not in the budget. It's not been included in a spending review. Now, that doesn't mean to say there's no extra money for defence. What it means is that they're not saying where the money's coming from. But another thing the government haven't, also the government, the amount of money that the government are actually committing is way less than the 75 billion they're claiming. It's actually just a few billion. But another thing the government are not saying is where the money's coming from, because right now they're trying to raise spending in areas they think their voters approve of, defence, and cut taxes where they think they can as well. Now, it all makes political sense, of course, in election year, but the way they're doing it is to make certain assumptions. For example, Sunak says he'll pay for the defence boost with spending cuts elsewhere. But where? I'll come on to that in a moment. But let's talk about some other spending cuts he's talked about. Last week, he talked about cutting the welfare budget by getting more people into work. Oh, he's layabouts getting them into work. Okay, right. He's no plan for getting these people into work other than shouting at people to get a job. And, you know, he wants, for example, more disabled people in work. But he's just axed the government programme which helps disabled people into work. So he's going to get fewer disabled people into work. He complains about people with serious illnesses. Oh, you're too ill to work. Oh, get to work. But he's given us record NHS waiting lists. Why don't you treat them? He's not removing barriers for disabled people in the workplace. He's not treating people with serious illnesses. So this notion of getting more people to work isn't happening because he hasn't got a plan to do it. So the welfare budget won't go down under his watch, but he's assuming it will, no doubt using the savings he expects to justify the tax cuts. But because the tax cuts will be real and the savings will not, it will just put a hole in the real budget, which will have to be filled with more borrowing, which I'll come to in a moment, because there's another claim here on spending cuts. Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, has said that this extra £75 billion for defence, which, as the IFS have shown, doesn't actually exist, by the way, this extra £75 billion for defence will be paid for by cutting 72,000 civil service jobs. Well, first of all, we need those civil servants. The reason we have more than we used to, because Tories keep saying, oh, we've got more than we did in 2015. Yeah, do you think that might have something to do with Brexit? I mean, actually, they cut the civil service more than they should have by 2015 anyway. But Brexit has meant that there's now more work to be done. Brexit created massive amounts of bureaucracy. If you have an increased level of bureaucracy, you need an increased number of bureaucrats. And if you cut these civil servants, the work they're doing doesn't just go away. You know, just as with shortages in the NHS, people didn't stop being ill or injured. No, we just ended up with NHS waiting lists increasing. Cutbacks in the justice system, we ended up with a backlog of court cases. Asylum processing, we had a backlog of asylum claims. You know, if you cut the workforce, the work doesn't go away, it just builds up. But the claim is also a mathematical nonsense. Grant Shapps says he can save £75 billion over 6 years by sacking 72,000 civil servants. Now, if he sacks them all tomorrow, which they're not doing, by the way, but if it wasn't phased in, if they were just going to get rid of 72,000 tomorrow, in order to save £75 billion over the next 6 years by doing this, those civil servants would need to be on an average annual salary of £173,000 a year. There are not many civil servants on £173,000 a year, and certainly not the ones they will be chopping. And so there won't be any chopping of privately educated consultants, I'll tell you that much. So there's so many holes in these spending plans that it's completely unreal. And yet the media not pointing them out. They were happy to promote the announcement on their front pages. Oh, Conservatives promise to boost defence spending by this much. Hardly a word of caution about the fact that, first of all, that's still less than it was under Labour. And second of all, where's the money coming from? Because where they say it's coming from isn't real. It's an illusion. And talking about illusions, as if by magic, we had news this week that the government borrowing was higher than expected to the tune of nearly £7 billion as well. What's that? That's those tax cuts. So far, what have we got here? We've got £46 billion a year of unfunded national insurance tax cuts planned. We've got about 12, 13 billion pounds a year of defence spending boost that they claim it's not going to happen, but they claim is going to happen. So we're up to about, nearly 60 billion pounds here. We've had about 20 billion pounds worth of tax cuts, which are clearly unfunded because borrowing is much higher than was expected. So we've basically borrowed for those tax cuts as well. So you're on to about 80 billion pounds straight away. And the Tories think they need another round of tax cuts to help them in the election, assuming they haven't called the election by the time they can announce another mini budget. So you may actually, before the election takes place, be in a situation where Sunak is promising about £100 billion worth of unfunded spending and tax cutting plans, completely unfunded. £100 billion hole in his budget by the time the election comes around per year. And the worry is that they won't even attempt to make the figures add up beyond what's strictly necessary to avoid the pound crashing like it did under Liz Truss, which is another reason why we need the media reform. Because what the Tories are doing is just an illusion, but it will have real consequences because the tax cuts are real. They are reducing the tax receipts because it's not, they say it stimulates growth, but it hasn't. Otherwise, why is our borrowing increasing more than expected? It isn't stimulating growth. We don't get overall equal or higher receipts with the lower rate of tax. We just get lower tax receipts. And because the spending cuts are non-existent, because there isn't really anything left to cut after 14 years, that gap between incomes and outgoings for the Treasury increases, which means more borrowing. And because interest rates are now higher, the cost of managing that borrowing is much more expensive as well. When you consider the national insurance policy, the defence spending policy, the tax cuts already announced, as well as the ones they still want to announce this September, assuming the election has still to be called at that point, Sunak, as I say, is potentially setting up, somewhere between 80 and £100 billion hole in the budget. And the strategy for them serves a dual purpose. Again, we have this system where they're incentivized to do this reckless and dangerous thing because it's designed to attract votes during the election itself, because they're claiming these spending plans and tax cuts are real when they're not. So it attracts votes for them to limit the damage. But also it creates a false alternate reality when Labour in government. Well, we had plans to cut all these taxes, but you've just put them back up again. Same old Labour tax and spend. And the media are enabling it. They've enabled the destruction of our national infrastructure, our international trading and diplomatic relations, and they continue to do so. Whoever thought letting a few billionaires, most of whom don't even live in the UK, be in charge of our news could go so wrong? But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.